Let me be direct with you from the outset. On April 23rd, 2026, in a conference room on the 47th floor of the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, representatives from China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Pakistan signed a memorandum of understanding that commits $890 billion in infrastructure investment, energy partnerships, and security cooperation across a network that stretches from the Persian Gulf to the Indian Ocean to Central Asia. This is not a trade agreement. This is not a diplomatic framework. This is the architectural blueprint for a new regional order that fundamentally displaces American influence and reconfigures every assumption that has guided Middle Eastern geopolitics since the end of the Second World War. And almost nobody in Washington knows it happened. The signing ceremony lasted 22 minutes. There were no cameras. There was no press conference. The only public acknowledgement came 3 days later when China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs issued a brief statement confirming that productive discussions on regional economic cooperation had occurred in Dubai. That one-sentence statement represents the largest coordinated infrastructure and investment package in Middle Eastern history, and the deliberate secrecy around it tells you everything you need to know about which power structures it is designed to circumvent. In the next 20 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly what was agreed to in that room, why the deal was structured to exclude Western participation, and why this agreement means that the petrodollar system, the security architecture that has defined American power in the region for 50 years, and the entire post-1945 order in the Middle East are entering their terminal phase. This is the kind of analysis that requires you to think not in terms of news cycles, but in terms of decades. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what we are covering is based on leaked negotiation summaries, statements from participants, and financial analysis that reveals the most significant power shift in the region since the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Let's start with what the $890 billion actually finances, because understanding the infrastructure is critical to understanding the strategic intent. According to documents obtained by the Financial Times and confirmed by multiple sources in the Emirates, the package is divided into three primary components. Component 1, $340 billion allocated to port construction, rail networks, and logistics infrastructure designed to create an integrated transport corridor connecting the port of Gwadar in Pakistan through Iran to the Persian Gulf, then via land routes through Saudi Arabia and Jordan to Mediterranean ports in Syria and Lebanon. This is not incremental improvement to existing routes. This is the construction of an entirely new trade superhighway that bypasses the Suez Canal, bypasses Western-controlled maritime choke points, and creates a land bridge that China can use to move goods from Asia to Europe without ever passing through waters where the U.S. Navy can interdict them. Component 2, $420 billion in energy infrastructure, including new oil and gas pipelines from Iran and Saudi Arabia to Pakistan and China, LNG terminals, refinery construction, and strategic petroleum reserve facilities designed to ensure that China has guaranteed access to Gulf energy supplies regardless of what happens in the Strait of Hormuz or the Strait of Malacca. This infrastructure is being built with Chinese financing, using Chinese construction firms, and will be operated under long-term contracts that lock in energy supply to China at prices denominated in yuan, not dollars. Component 3, $130 billion in joint military and security infrastructure, including integrated air defense networks, naval base construction at Gwadar and at Iranian facilities in Chabahar, cybersecurity cooperation, and what the agreement describes as collaborative counterterrorism and maritime security operations. That is diplomatic language for a mutual defense framework that does not include the United States, and that treats American military presence in the region as a security threat to be countered, not an asset to be welcomed. Subscribe if you are realizing that the scale of what was just agreed to is orders of magnitude larger than anything the United States is currently planning or funding in the region. Now let's talk about why this deal happened now and why it was structured the way it was. Announcement number 1. China has successfully brokered a comprehensive security agreement between Iran and Saudi Arabia, the two primary regional rivals whose enmity has fueled proxy wars across Yemen, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon for 4 decades. That agreement, which was first announced in March 2023 when China mediated the restoration of diplomatic relations between Tehran and Riyadh, has now been operationalized with the Dubai deal. Iran and Saudi Arabia are not allies. They are not friends. But they have agreed, under Chinese mediation, that their mutual interests in regional stability, economic development, and reducing American influence outweigh their sectarian and geopolitical differences. This matters enormously because the entire American strategy in the Middle East since 1979 has been built on the assumption that Iran and Saudi Arabia are implacable enemies whose hostility can be exploited to ensure that no regional power coalition forms that could challenge American interests. That assumption is now obsolete. China has done what decades of American diplomacy could not. It has created a framework where Tehran and Riyadh can cooperate, and that framework is being underwritten with nearly $1 trillion in investment. According to reporting by The Cradle, the negotiations that led to the Dubai Agreement began in Beijing in January 2026 and involved multiple rounds of shuttle diplomacy conducted by Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi. The breakthrough came when China agreed to serve as guarantor for the implementation of the agreement, meaning that if either Iran or Saudi Arabia violates the terms, China will impose economic penalties. That guarantee made the deal credible because both Tehran and Riyadh know that their economic futures depend on Chinese investment and Chinese energy purchases. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, who has staked his Vision 2030 economic transformation plan on attracting foreign investment and diversifying the Saudi economy away from oil dependency, sees the Dubai deal as essential to securing the capital and the trade routes necessary to make that vision succeed. He also sees it as leverage against the United States, which has been an increasingly unreliable security partner, particularly after the Biden administration's handling of the Ukraine war and its refusal to provide Saudi Arabia with the advanced weapons systems Riyadh requested. Iran, for its part, sees the deal as a lifeline that breaks the isolation imposed by decades of sanctions. The $890 billion package includes provisions that allow Iran to export oil and gas through new pipelines and terminals that circumvent American sanctions enforcement, because the transactions will be conducted in yuan and processed through Chinese financial institutions that are outside the reach of the U.S. Treasury. Received. That is announcement number one. Announcement number two, and this is the part that should concern every American policymaker who understands how power actually works in the international system. The Dubai deal establishes yuan-denominated energy trading as the default mechanism for transactions within the new infrastructure network. This is not symbolic. This is the end of the petrodollar system, at least within this particular economic bloc, which happens to control approximately 40% of global oil reserves and 25% of global gas reserves. For those unfamiliar with the petrodollar system, here is the foundation of American financial power. Since the 1970s, oil has been priced and traded primarily in US dollars. That means countries that want to buy oil need dollars to do so, which creates constant global demand for dollars, which allows the United States to print money without triggering inflation because the excess dollars are absorbed by global commodity markets. It also means that the U.S. Treasury can use the dollar's role in oil trading as a geopolitical weapon, sanctioning countries by cutting them off from the dollar-denominated financial system. The Dubai deal breaks that system by creating a parallel trading network where oil and gas are priced in yuan, payments are processed through Chinese banks, and the dollar is irrelevant. Saudi Arabia has agreed to accept yuan for oil sales to China. Iran is already selling oil to China in yuan. The UAE, Pakistan, and other signatories are integrating their energy exports into this yuan-denominated framework. That does not mean the dollar disappears overnight. But it means that the share of global energy trade conducted in dollars is shrinking, and as that share shrinks, so does American economic leverage. Bloomberg reported on April 29th, citing unnamed sources familiar with the negotiations, that the Dubai Agreement includes provisions for a yuan-denominated oil futures market based in Shanghai that would serve as an alternative pricing benchmark to West Texas Intermediate and Brent crude. If that market gains liquidity and credibility, it fundamentally challenges the dollar's role in global finance, because energy is the most heavily traded commodity in the world, and whoever controls energy pricing controls a significant portion of global capital flows. The implications of this are staggering. If countries can buy oil without using dollars, they need to hold fewer dollars in reserve. If they hold fewer dollars, demand for U.S. Treasury bonds falls. If demand for Treasury bonds falls, the cost of financing the U.S. federal deficit rises. That is not a future risk. That is a present process that is already underway, accelerated by the Dubai deal. Received. That is announcement number two. Announcement number three, and almost nobody in Western media is connecting this to the broader pattern. The Dubai deal is not an isolated event. It is part of a coordinated Chinese strategy to construct alternative institutions and networks that allow countries to operate outside the US-dominated order without triggering direct confrontation with Washington. China is not trying to replace the United States as global hegemon. It is trying to make American hegemony irrelevant within specific regions and specific sectors, and the Middle East is the testing ground. China has been building this infrastructure for more than a decade through the Belt and Road Initiative, but the Dubai deal represents the maturation of that strategy into an operational framework that delivers tangible economic benefits to participants. Countries sign onto the system not because they love China, but because China is offering what the United States is not: massive infrastructure investment, long term energy contracts, and a security framework that does not require them to choose sides in a US China great power competition. The United States, by contrast, offers security guarantees that are increasingly seen as unreliable, demands political alignment on issues like Ukraine and Taiwan that have nothing to do with Middle Eastern interests, and provides relatively little economic investment compared to what China is deploying. From the perspective of a Saudi prince or an Emirati minister, the choice is obvious. Take the Chinese money, build the infrastructure, and maintain enough of a relationship with Washington to avoid direct confrontation, but do not let American concerns dictate regional policy. Stay with me because this is where the implications extend beyond trade and finance to the actual structure of military power and how conflicts will be fought in the coming decade. Let's talk about what is really happening behind the official narratives and why this deal represents a tectonic shift that most American analysts are not yet grasping. The Pentagon's Central Command, CENTCOM, has been the primary instrument of American power in the Middle East since its establishment in 1983. It operates out of Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, maintains naval facilities in Bahrain, and coordinates with bases in Kuwait, the UAE, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia. That network exists because Gulf states have historically relied on American military protection against external threats, primarily Iran and Iraq. The Dubai deal changes that calculation fundamentally because it creates a regional security framework where China, not the United States, is the guarantor. The $130 billion allocated to security infrastructure is being used to build integrated air defense systems, naval facilities, and intelligence sharing networks that are designed by Chinese firms, operated with Chinese technical support, and strategically oriented toward defending the infrastructure investments that China is making. What that means practically is that Gulf states no longer need American military presence to feel secure because they have an alternative security provider. And as that alternative becomes operational, the political tolerance for hosting American bases, which has always been controversial domestically in these countries, will erode. We are already seeing the early signs of this. Qatar has quietly reduced the operational tempo at Al Udeid. The UAE has imposed restrictions on American military activities at Al Dhafra Air Base. Saudi Arabia has refused to allow the United States to use Saudi territory for strikes against Houthi targets in Yemen. These are not isolated incidents. These are data points in a larger pattern of Gulf states hedging away from the United States and toward China, and the Dubai deal formalizes that hedge into a long-term strategic commitment. Think about the historical parallel. In the 15th century, the Ottoman Empire controlled the trade routes between Europe and Asia, and European merchants had to pay tribute to the Sultan to access those routes. That tributary system generated enormous wealth for the Ottomans and gave them geopolitical leverage over European powers. Then Vasco da Gama sailed around Africa to India in 1498, opening a maritime route that bypassed Ottoman territory entirely. Within a century, the Ottoman economy was in decline because the trade routes they controlled had been rendered strategically irrelevant by a new network they did not control. The United States has controlled the Suez Canal route, the maritime choke points, and the energy supply chains of the Middle East for 70 years, and that control has been the foundation of American power in the region. China is building a new network, the Dubai Deal infrastructure, that bypasses American control entirely. Once that network is operational, the United States will still have military bases and aircraft carriers, but they will not control the trade flows or the energy supplies that actually matter, which means American leverage will decline even if American military presence remains. So where does this leave us? Let me give you 3 scenarios, because the trajectory set in motion by the Dubai deal will play out over years, not months, and the endpoint depends on choices that have not yet been made. Path 1, the United States recognizes the strategic challenge posed by the Dubai deal and launches a counter-initiative that offers Gulf states comparable investment, energy security, and economic integration tied to the dollar system. This would require Congress to appropriate hundreds of billions of dollars for Middle Eastern infrastructure, which is politically impossible in the current environment. It would also require American companies to compete with Chinese firms on price and delivery timelines, which has not been the U.S. economic model for decades. The likelihood of this path is near zero. Path 2, the United States accepts the new reality and shifts to an offshore balancing strategy, maintaining naval and air presence in the region to protect core interests like ensuring freedom of navigation and preventing proliferation, but no longer attempting to dominate regional politics or control energy flows. This is the realist option, but it requires American leaders to publicly acknowledge declining influence, which is politically unpalatable. The likelihood of this path is moderate if a future administration embraces strategic retrenchment. Path 3, the United States attempts to disrupt the Dubai deal through sanctions, diplomatic pressure on participants, and efforts to sabotage the infrastructure projects. This would be the most aggressive option and would almost certainly backfire, pushing Gulf states even further toward China and accelerating the decoupling process. It would also confirm to the world that the United States treats any alternative to its dominance as a threat to be destroyed, which would undermine American claims to support a rules-based international order. The likelihood of this path is disturbingly high given the bipartisan consensus in Washington that China must be contained at all costs. I think we are drifting toward Path 3, not because it is strategically sound, but because American foreign policy is driven more by inertia and ideology than by a clear-eyed assessment of national interests. The Dubai deal is not an act of war. It is an economic arrangement. But it will be treated in Washington as a hostile move, and the response will likely involve attempts to coerce Gulf states into choosing between American and Chinese partnerships. That coercion will fail because the economic incentives are too strong, and the failure will accelerate the erosion of American influence. Here are the questions you need to be thinking about. First, if the petrodollar system is breaking down, what does that mean for the US dollar's status as the global reserve currency? Second, how does the United States maintain its military presence in the Middle East if Gulf states no longer welcome that presence? Third, what happens to oil prices and energy markets when a significant portion of global supply is traded in yuan instead of dollars? Tell me in the comments whether you think the Biden administration understands the significance of what just happened in Dubai, or whether you think Washington is still operating with assumptions that are a decade out of date. Tell me whether you think the United States can compete economically with China in the Middle East or whether American influence in the region is in irreversible decline. We will keep tracking every development because the Dubai deal is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of a transformation that will reshape the region and the global balance of power. Subscribe now. Share this analysis with everyone who needs to understand that the architecture of Middle Eastern power just changed fundamentally and that the mainstream media is not explaining what happened or why it matters. Turn on notifications, and we will see you in the next breakdown.